Hello there, people. Welcome to Personal 20 and a live. We're going to give a few moments for people to join us. Connie here with Personal 20, the Electro Fitness Studio, and supporting everyone while we're still staying at home and then some. We have a special guest with us tonight. We have Dr. Michael Hayes.
Social distancing.
We're doing a social distancing YouTube. And as you come on to the YouTube, please say hello and let me know if you're there. Just going to give another moment. We have two people there. There. Okay. So you see Melissa just wrote hi.
Okay.
So this is Dr. Hayes' first YouTube live too. So I just wanted to point those things out. That's where people will be asking questions.
Okay.
And I can help write answers, but we can verbalize our answers. That's better too. Okay. So welcome tonight. I would like to introduce our special guest. We're just so excited that Dr. Michael Hayes is with us tonight. I'd like to introduce him. He's a board-certified spinal surgeon. And with that expertise on the spine, he's also, with his career, has dedicated his life to helping men and women, not only that suffer with these back issues, he's just as much dedicated to educating them on nutrition and exercise. Speaking of exercise, he happens to include in his variety of exercise some electro fitness training at Personal 20. So we love having him with us. And he has a vast knowledge of nutrition. And obviously, when we're at Personal 20 exercising, we love talking about nutrition. It's so key for results. So even though our subject tonight is the benefits of protein in the diet, he has vast experience with the macronutrients, the micronutrients, with fasting. It's fascinating to speak to him. He's also one of the expert testimonials from those of you that have read the book, The Whole 30 Diet. So that's also very interesting. Oh, and he's going to be a future author himself. So he'll let you know about some of the books he's about to write. So without further ado, I will be passing all of you to Dr. Hayes.
Well, hello. This is my first YouTube video, and I was asked if I wanted to talk about anything, and what the team here asked me to talk about was nutrition and protein. Now, let's go back to my background. People say that doctors don't get a lot of nutrition in their medical school training. If you want to go by our credit hours, it's probably true, but we also have many years of hormones as well as biochemistry, which basically is what nutrition is. Once you start saying what the nutrients, such as the carbohydrates and the proteins, as well as the essential fats, are the macronutrients, and then we get into the vitamins and the minerals and those other micronutrients that we all need. We get abundant amount of that information. The question is, are we really interested in that preventive type of nutrition? I remember back in one of the classes where it was described that some vitamin had a certain recommended daily allowance. And what the definition of the recommended daily allowance at that time, and still is the amount of a certain nutrient that is the minimum amount, as determined by a committee, that the majority of the people who are already healthy can avoid disease. And I just shook my head and said, that sounds sort of messed up. That would mean on a bell curve like this, a bell curve of the population, the part that's healthy already, which we already know that 88% of us are metabolically not healthy. But that means 12%, if they eat this much on this curve, can avoid disease. I'm not interested in that. I want to be on this side of the bell curve to optimize my health. And I want to be the healthiest person I can be by exercise, by nutrition, by sunlight, whatever I can do to help me heal from injuries and also to avoid disease and be healthy from disease and go from that as a perspective. So that's the foundation that I use to get in shape and to eat optimally. So we started talking about proteins. Well, we need to go back, and we just spent a few minutes talking about all the different diets out there. We talked about the food pyramids. We talked about Ansel Keys and his derivation that we got into this whole cholesterol myth and this whole eating plenty of grains and food pyramids and all of that type of thing, which gets more into sociology and epidemiology as opposed to actually what our body really uses. We talked about other applications of these nutrition profiles by such diets as the paleo, the keto, the low carb, the intermittent fasting, all of those, which are all applications trying to apply the appropriate amount of nutrition we get and the timing nutrition so that we can balance our hormones appropriately and our body can heal and grow to its optimal amount. Let's get into the topic that they actually asked me to talk about, which is proteins. So from a foundational perspective, there's 3 macronutrients. Those are the protein, those are the fats, and those are the carbohydrates. So if we look at those 3 groups, proteins are what we use in order to build the building blocks of our body. Our bones are made predominantly of proteins. Our muscles are proteins and amino acids. Our collagen, our tendons, our hair, our skin, that's all proteins. Many of the amino acids also make up most of the hormones in our body that communicate with each other. So proteins are essential. We need a certain amount of proteins in order to grow, in order to be healthy. The second group is the group of fats. There are certain fats that are good for us. There are certain fats that are evil for us. But we need the good fats. The fats help carry fat-soluble vitamins throughout our body. Fats help cushion our body. Our brain is made out of mostly fats. Our myelin sheaths, the insulation are certain type of fats. Every one of our cell walls have certain fats in them, and we need them. And also, fats are a great energy source for our body. Our mitochondria love to burn fat. And when it burns fat, it burns one of the small parts of fat, which are known as either the backbone, the glycerol backbone, or the various ketones or triglycerides. So when we're using those fats as energy, that's where we start measuring ketones in our body. So when we're burning fat, we have ketones. That's as simple as that. A keto diet means we're burning fats. And so unlike proteins, which can be used for energy, it's ideally used for growing our body. Fats are required for our body, but also are essentially, it can be used for energy. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, most carbohydrates, we actually don't need to eat one carbohydrate ever. Our body can make whatever carbohydrates we need, and most carbohydrates are mostly energy. So when we start talking about how we mix these together, when we eat a regular nutritional diet, when we eat regular normal food, there is a certain ratio that proteins and fats and carbohydrates are made up of, that when you go and deconstruct a regular normal meal, we'll come up and say, oh, that's about 10% protein, that's about 30% fat, this is about 40% carbohydrates, or whatever they are. So that comes from a reductionist way of looking at things. So when we start looking at that, then we start talking about, oh, is this a high fat or low fat, or a high protein or a low protein diet? Let's skip that paradigm altogether. Let's not even talk about what a high protein diet is first, or what a low protein diet is, because that's usually a ratio based on other calories that we eat, regardless of the type of diet we have. If we want to start looking at proteins, let's look at essentially what does our body really need? And the amount of proteins we need are basically based on how big our body is, how active our body is, and we can go by a general rule of thumb, our ideal weight or our lean body mass or a typical weight, and say, based on your weight, you need to have a certain amount of protein or a certain number of amino acids, which can be measured as grams of protein. I think it's inappropriate to be calling protein and counting them as calories most of the time, because by definition, a calorie is the amount of energy burned when you actually consume that product. I think it's like a cubic centimeter or a gram of the protein. How many calories does it make? How many to raise a certain amount of water a degree centigrade? And if we're not using that protein as an energy source, it doesn't make sense to call it the energy. But we do it anyway, we just sort of accept it. So the general recommended daily allowance, what we need, according to avoid disease, is about 0.8 grams per kilogram of our body weight. And it's typically our ideal body weight, because many of us are overweight. We shouldn't go by that. And it's come to pass that the recommended daily allowance for most people is not enough. In fact, most recommendations at this point is about double the recommended daily allowance. So if you look at most researchers right now, how much protein do we need every day? It's somewhere about 1.6 to up to potentially 2.2 grams per kilogram. If we talk about pounds, that's about 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of your ideal body weight. And that's what we actually need.
So let's try and make that a little more practical for us lay people. Often it's referred to about 25 grams of protein would be the size of your palm if it was chicken, for example. Do you have any references like that that would help us figure out what would be our ideal protein?
Well, why don't you, let's do a little research on that one. But there's one more point to this. If we know that if you eat an egg, it's about 6 or 7 grams of protein.
Okay.
If you eat an ounce of red meat, it's about 6 or 7 grams of protein. So it's very similar. Those are about the amounts, and we can look that up. But when we get into the total amount, there's also a side thing that we need to be aware of, is that most Americans don't get enough protein. And there's been a lot of research in the last 5 or 10 years that have demonstrated that we need a certain amount of protein. In fact, we need a certain amount of a particular amino acid called leucine in order to open the key to allow these amino acids to go in, to actually get into our muscles, to actually build muscle. So if we don't have enough leucine in our body, the key doesn't open and the protein just doesn't build your muscle. It works out that we need about 2.5 grams of leucine in a meal, which don't worry about reading that. But in general, what that means is if we eat a good complete protein that has a bunch of amino acids, if we eat about 30 grams of protein in a meal, we almost always will get plenty of leucine. So the initial target, we should have at least 30 grams every meal. So from your perspective here is how do we get 30 grams?
5 eggs for breakfast?
I have 4 eggs and a sausage and a glass of milk for breakfast because I want to have at least 50 grams per meal. I usually get 50 or 60 grams of protein in my 2 or 3 meals. At my weight, my lean body mass is probably about 180 pounds. So my target is about 180 grams because my body weight is about 200. So that's about 0.8. So that's my initial start is I find out how much I need. And as we get older, most people don't eat enough protein, and also our body doesn't digest it as much. So we actually need more. But at a minimum, we need 30 grams per meal. And that's our foundation. That's not a high diet. That's not a low diet. If you want to get into what would be considered a high protein diet, we just know by feeding people as well as feeding animals that once we start eating about 3.4 grams per kilogram, which is about 1.5 grams per pound, at about that level, that's about the maximum our enzymes can use to work the protein. So that would be considered a high protein diet. But if you're sticking about 1.8 or you're eating 30 grams, like I eat 50 grams, and my goal is to get 50 or 60 grams 2 or 3 times a day. And that's my protein. And that's not high or low, that's just what I need.
So maybe I should do a little math, and
Let's do some math.
Whoever's at home wants to follow. So I take my body weight and I'll be multiplying by?
why don't you do your body weight times?
So I'm
Is that-
about,
is that-
I'm
is
about
it-
132
132, multiply that by 0.7.
at 0.7.
0.7 or 0.8.
So that gives me 92.
So that's about a good amount of protein to have every day. If you're really working out hard, you might want to have 130 grams. Like if you were someone working out 3 or 4 hours a day, an Olympic class athlete and things like that, then you may need that extra protein because you're doing a lot more repair.
Okay.
And the leucine that you were aware of, there was a question I just glanced at and I saw, is that the most protein sources, particularly proteins that you get from animals and dairy products and whey, will have plenty of protein in this and plenty of leucine. So the math, once you deconstruct and know you need these different amino acids, then when we put it all together and just think 30 grams of protein from a good solid source, then we don't have to worry about it anymore. I like to dive deep into something and make it simple. I don't want to be counting my leucine every day. As long as I have my 4 or 5 eggs and my glass of milk, I'm fine. Or if I have a palm size piece of meat, or if I have 2 quarter pounders of meat without the bread. So I eat hamburger or steak frequently. I may have chicken, I may have stir fry, I may have a bunch of other things, but that's what I look at. And I try to make it simple because we know that getting the leucine should be available in most of those products.
So I just want to encourage, as people are watching, if you have questions during, feel free to write your questions in. And I'm also wondering, what would you recommend? What's a good source of protein? Is it when it's whole, fresh, organic? How important is that?
The more natural you can get, the better. For example, grass-fed animals probably have the best fat profile with them. The proteins by themselves are about the same. It's just the fat profile that goes along with it. We know that most foods have about 1 gram of protein and they have about 1 gram of fat with them. That's just how a natural meal comes together. So it ends up being for every 4 calories, we already talked about calories, 1 gram of protein is 4 calories of protein, 1 gram of fat is about 9 calories of fats. So that gives us a reasonable balance of what our ratios will become. So remember, we're not here trying to determine if we're going to have a high protein diet or a low protein diet. I'm going to have the optimal protein diet. And let's say if I want to lose some fat, if I want to become more insulin sensitive, not be insulin resistant. Let's say I'm overweight, I'm insulin resistant. So what I need to do is turn my insulin back down so my cells can become more sensitive. So I need to have fewer carbohydrates because carbohydrates are the major spur to bring insulin up to block the release of fat. So if I don't want to block my release of fat so I can burn my own fat energy, I mean, why else would we have the fat in our body? Our fat's there for in between meals or during times when we're not having abundant food. So we want to be able to have direct access to having that energy. So if I'm going to be on a nutritional diet where I want to have fewer calories and I want to burn my own fat, the number of calories I may have may not be, let's say, 2,200 a day. I may choose to bring it down to maybe 1,500 or 1,200 a day. But I'm not doing that. I'm doing that in a specific way of maintaining my protein. And I'm also keeping my carbohydrates low enough so I'm not starving myself by not letting myself burn the fat. Because that way, every day, even though I'm not putting that extra 500 or 1,000 calories of fat in my mouth and calories in my mouth, my body's still getting that same 1,000 or 1,500 calories from the fat that I store here or here. Almost all of us have months worth of energy that we could easily use for all of our nutritional needs. So we're not ever starving as long as we don't block the release and we don't have excess insulin. So when I'm having fewer calories, my percentage of protein is going to be at a higher percentage. So some people, relatively misguided, would say they're on a high protein diet. That makes no sense. And then when they're starting eating more calories, there's no reason to increase the amount of protein. That protein doesn't go up as a ratio. You still need that a certain amount of protein. And then it ends up becoming a lower ratio. So high or low protein, using the ratios in this case can just mix some people up.
So do we have any questions there for you so far?
We talked about protein sources. There's a lot of protein sources. The most bioavailable sources are probably meat products, including dairy products, including fish, including seafood. Those are the most bioavailable. Now, if you're eating more vegetarian or even vegan, it is doable. It's just much more difficult to get that profile. What the recommendations that I mentioned earlier to get enough leucine, typically it's about 30 grams for the typical American diet, which ends up being about 70% of the protein comes from the animal products and 30% comes from protein. If you end up being more animal-based or more carnivore-ish type of diet, you might only need about 24, 25 grams of protein to get that leucine to open that key. If you're more of a vegetarian type of diet or a vegan diet, you may actually need 45 or 50 grams of that protein in order to get it to be bioavailable and absorbed by your body. So it can be done, but the amino acid profile, the way it's mixed in the nutrient, it is pretty much a complete mixture in most animal products, which means like eggs, chicken, meat, fish, shrimp, all of that. If you're eating more plant-based, there are more issues that some plants may have more of certain amino acids than other amino acids, so you have to make sure you get enough of the beans or the legumes and mix it with other things and have to balance them out. Then you have to make sure that they don't have the compounds that actually will block the nutrition to be absorbed, because that's how plants protect themselves, by having these lectins and glutens and the phytins, the hemagglutins and all those things in them. So we need to be able to prepare our food in a way that they're available for us. We also have to be just aware and combine them well so that we get enough of the amino acids so we have adequate protein. So it's very doable, but it takes a lot more work.
I think you have a few more questions there on Facebook.
Should I take a protein shake before working out or after? One question, my answer on protein shakes in general is it's better to eat real food. So eating protein shakes by themselves, I don't buy into. Although I think it's reasonable to consider. Now, concerning working out, let's see, what does it depends on the purpose, but for most people, when I have looked at the literature and when I work at things, my bias is I will work out on an empty stomach, ideally. I will work out in the morning because I want to work out when my insulin levels are the lowest they can be. I want to work out when my cortisol level automatically is rising, so that way I can take advantage of the gluconeogenesis that happens with the extra cortisol. I want to be able to burn that extra little bit of glucose that's in my liver that hasn't been consumed overnight. And with that, my insulin levels are low, so my growth hormone is as high as it's going to be. So working out will increase my growth hormone, because once you start eating and adding in the energy and the sugars, will block growth hormone release, will increase the insulin, will block the ability to burn fat. So I want to rev up the fat burning so that I can get my enzymes to be flexible to be able to burn fat or carbs as an energy source. Then, if I am going to add the protein in, I usually would add that in after the workout, 45 to 50 minutes later, maybe an hour and a half later. And if you choose to have a protein shake, that's very fine and dandy, particularly because one of the best ways to absorb the amino acids is whey protein. So the whey protein is some of the best bioavailable for all the amino acids, along with eggs, which have some of the highest ratings. So I would, if you're going to do that, I would do it afterwards, not before. What's the optimum ratio per day for a meat-eating woman who has 1,800 calories per day? So let's say, what would an average woman that works out weigh?
Well, I weigh about 132. I'm
Okay.
5'3.5".
So let's say 140 pounds. So 140 pounds, the amount of protein you should have is, if you are anywhere
140 times 0.7?
anywhere between 0.7 and 1.
99.4.
So somewhere between 80 to 100 grams of protein a day. That would make sense. And if you're going to have 30 grams per meal, that gives you about 90 grams per day, which makes sense. That would get enough leucine. And there is a window about 3 to 4 hours after we eat protein that our muscles sort of turn off and become somewhat resistant for a little bit of absorbing some amino acids. So if you're having the meals separated by that period of time, you're having 30, 30, 30, you end up getting about 90 grams. Okay, so let's do the math to answer that question. If you're having 90 grams of protein, and let's convert that to calories, even though we don't want to burn it as energy, 90 times 4 is?
360.
Okay, 360. So you got 360, and the question was, in an 1,800 calorie diet, what is the percentage? So
Divide that.
by 1,800.
20%.
So that's a 20% diet. Now, that just works out to be 20%. The way the question was asked, I don't really align with that way that question was asked. I align with the way, how much protein do you need? You need about 90 grams, 80 to 100 grams, depending upon what your goals are and what your needs are, your activity levels are. You need that to maintain the ability to build your ligaments, to build your muscles, to have the reserve in case you do get sick, because the branched chain amino acids can be used to help with inflammation. You need that amount of protein. And if by chance 1,800 calories as a whole bucket of energy that you have ends up being 20%, so be it. If you need more energy because you are a triathlete, you may need a little bit more protein, and maybe you're going to be up at 1 gram per kilogram or 1 gram per pound, which is about 2.2 grams per kilogram, the same deal. So you'd be at about 120 grams of protein, but you might be burning through 3,000 or 4,000 calories per day, like some of the Olympic class rowers that I know are. They need that amount of protein, but with the amount of energy that they're having to be able to burn and go through that rowing program, even though they're having more protein, their percentage might only be 12%. So I think thinking of percentages for proteins guides us down the wrong path, because then someone's going to say, well, that's high, that's low, and then you're going to get confused. We just need to know how much protein we need and then deal with it. Let's see. I think those are the basic questions. I do not know what particular plants have the best sources of leucine. That's something we'd have to look at on some of the websites, such as, I don't know if MyFitnessPal goes into that, maybe Chronometer does, but we might have to go into that to actually find out where that leucine is in the non-animal-based world. In the animal-based world, you don't have to worry about it. It's in there. It's just, it's such a complete group, you don't have to worry about having enough leucine.
So you mentioned about, or somebody asked about if they were going to have a protein shake, should they have it after or before the workout? And you explained why it'd be more beneficial after. From your perspective, what's the ideal thing to eat before workout if somebody is coming from work and it's been hours since they've had their last meal?
My bias at this point is not to eat before the workout. Drink water, have adequate salts in your nutrition so you don't become dehydrated, but just have enough diet. There's no reason that we should have to worry about not having enough nutrition when we're eating correctly. We should have the metabolic flexibility when we're not taking the nutrients out of the meal that we've had over the first hour or two after we eat, that if we need more energy after that, we should have our body trained to be able to burn the fat. So taking a snack before we eat, to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I can see that if you are at a high level of a triathlete, or if you are doing bike races every day, that we may need to supplement the way our energy is being burned and maybe need shakes and these various compounds before we work out, during the workout, and after, just because we don't have access to as much. But for the routine person that's out there, we don't need to do that. But for specific goals, for specific sports, for specific treatments of disease, for specific let's say, healing from planned surgeries, we might need to boost certain of these recommendations and change them. We may say you really should be taking 4 separate meals every 4 or 6 hours to build and optimize the protein in your nutrition for 10 days before surgery and 10 days after. And in fact, in the field of immunonutrition, we've actually been able to decrease the post-operative infections and poor wound healing, even in poorly nutrition or people who eat poorly beforehand. We can actually boost things if we are that aggressive. But it doesn't make sense to do that on a daily basis, but we can optimize depending upon what our goal is. But for the routine person, we shouldn't have to worry about going to a 20 or 30-minute workout and making sure that we ate our shake beforehand. That if you're doing that, that means your body is not trained enough to burn its own fat. And we have to go through that whole process and readjust what you're eating and when you're eating. Because not only what you eat is important, when we eat is important as well, because our body is designed to work in intervals, in bursts, to respond to the way we work out. And we need our times of rest, we need our times of stress. And if you look at it from one perspective, eating a meal isn't stressful, but it's an interval of our body has to do something. And then we should have that break. And we should have another interval and eat something and have that break. And sometimes having that break, even if it lasts 3, 4, 5 days at some points, sometimes having a fast like that is actually very healthy. It may be just healthy enough to, let's skip breakfast every so often and not eat after our evening meal that ends maybe 7 or 8 o'clock at night and not eat until noon or 1 o'clock the next day. That may help reset a lot that we have to do with the way our body is able to access our own energy sources. So that's where intermittent fasting and those ideas come in.
I think you might have one more question there that popped up.
Where do we go?
On the Facebook.
How could a person on a carbohydrate like a cereal, rice, bread, pasta rich diet shift towards a high protein diet? That is basically the standard American diet almost, or even and also a very cultural diet, and shifting to a high protein diet. This is one of those things that you almost have to do it moderately abruptly, meaning we either have to separate the times up between the meals longer, or we just have to cut those carbs and get rid of them. If we got rid of the grains, if we got rid of the sugars, that pretty much gets rid of any of the high glycemic index items. And you just need to do this. Let's compare a diet that is low in calories, but still eats those things that you just mentioned, that eats the carbohydrates. Like, if you have to realize that when you eat a carbohydrate, those are usually long chain carbohydrates that as soon as you start eating them, they're broken down in the mouth and in the stomach and so on. And when they get to the bloodstream, they're basically sugar molecules. Breads become sugar. It all just becomes sugar. It becomes glucose, sucrose, or fructose. It just all happens. So when you have more than a tablespoon or a teaspoon, it's like 4 or 5 grams in our body, in our bloodstream, our body says, you've got plenty, and it's going to drive the insulin up to say, we don't need any more. Let's store that away or burn it real fast. And as soon as the insulin goes up, we block all fat burning. This is why when you take someone and just put them on a low-calorie diet, but you don't get rid of the carbs and the sugars, you still might have enough insulin being produced, even if you're down at 800 calories a day. If you're having enough carbs for you to keep that insulin up that blocks the ability to burn our fats, then our body's just going to say, I'm not getting enough energy, and I can't get that food, that energy from my fats because my insulin's blocking it. So I'm just going to turn my basal metabolic rate down. And when it does that, you end up being cold, you get hungry, miserable, and tired. And grouchy. And grouchy. It happens because you don't have the energy. So you may have heard a story of someone who's been eating 22 or 2,500 calories all their life. Now they want to lose weight. So they get down to, let's say, 1,000 calories. They're just starving themselves. And when they're doing this, they don't get rid of enough carbs so their insulin still stays up so it doesn't block the fat. So their body turns down the metabolic rate way down to try to match that, because the body is pretty smart. It wants to survive. So if it gets that BMR down, you've probably heard of people saying, I've been on this diet, now I'm eating only 1,500 calories and I'm gaining weight again. That's because the basal metabolic rate's down. So you're gaining weight. And it can take up to 2 years for that to come back up. Do you ever wonder why the Biggest Loser never has a reunion show? It's probably because they all gain the weight back, because that same mechanism, because they don't get rid of the carbs. You pretty much just have to get rid of the carbs. You almost have to just say, I'm having fewer than 10 or 20 or 30 grams. For some people, it'd be less than 50, but just if you can get less than 30 grams of carbs in a day, most people will then shift over to burning fat because their insulin level is low enough to do this. Some people talk about fasting, and that's one way to not have enough carbs. By getting rid of the carbs, it's another way to force our body to start burning fats, because we're just not eating anything other than water and drinking, and maybe water and salt and some vitamins, because then we can turn our body into burning the fat. The expectation when you do this is, one thing you'll do initially is you're going to lose a bit of water, because when we are no longer storing that extra glucose in our liver, which is about 600 calories or so worth, for every molecule of glucose that we have, we need about 2 molecules of water. It's just the way things work. So if we're getting rid of that extra glucose in storage, we're going to lose a lot of water. You ever wonder why after Thanksgiving, if you eat a lot, you start gaining 5 pounds? Because you have extra glucose and a lot of water stays on board. So if you get rid of the carbs, you're going to pee out a bunch of water. You're probably going to get rid of some of the electrolytes. So you're going to fall behind on that. And that's probably the major cause you have when you get the so-called keto flu, or you get the carb addiction that leads to a headache. Majority of the time, it's not any of that. Majority of the time, it's because your electrolytes came down and you're running low on salt. So one of the things I recommend when you start this, when you get rid of the carbs in your diet, you just get rid of the grains, get rid of the flours, get rid of the cookies, get rid of all that stuff. If you drink some chicken broth, or add some salt to your water, but chicken broth or bouillon that has plenty of those minerals can pretty much get rid of the idea of getting headaches. So that's a huge thing. Another thing is I usually add some omega-3 fatty acids, the fish oils, to this, because as we begin to start losing the weight and start burning our fat, one of the other things that we do when we store the fat away is some of the bad fats that we eat, like the vegetable oils. Vegetable oils and these polyunsaturated industrial oils are evil. They cause complete metabolic problems. And when they were first introduced to, on a large scale, to the American diet in about late 1970s or 1980s, even though we've started to eat more processed foods up to that point, and we started getting more diabetes and heart disease, we sort of stabilized about 10 or 12% of the population being obese, if I remember the numbers right. But soon after the polyunsaturated fatty acids from the industrial oils, like the corn oil, the soybean oil, and all those other oils, suddenly our obesity epidemic shot up. Our Alzheimer's went up, our ADHD, our mental disease went up, our obesity went up, our diabetes just skyrocketed. So getting rid of those oils is hugely important. And as I was talking about, one of the other roles that our fat has done for a while is we've shunted the bad oils into that storage. So as we start burning our own fat, sometimes those bad oils will start getting back into our circulation. And we can try to counteract that with some omega-3 fatty acids to try to balance those out. But that's just one of the side effects of those stored toxins that we have to eventually flush out as we learn to burn our fats. So getting back to the initial question is, how do you get from a diet where you're eating a bunch of those processed foods and grains and Cheerios and all the things that I used to eat tons of when I was going through college and so on, is you just got to get rid of them. And they need to be low enough to bring your insulin low. So the number to get your carbohydrates low enough is not just a number based on a percentage. It's not just a number you come up with, and everybody's a little different. The number on a scale of 0 to 10 to 50 to 100 or 200, something up in here, is we need to be low enough that the trigger for insulin isn't triggered. Just like we need a certain amount of protein, it's not a percentage, we need the carbohydrates low enough not to trigger the insulin. Insulin's important. We need some insulin. We don't want to trigger so much to become insulin resistant and we can't burn our fat. So we need to have time and spacing in between our meals long enough to let the insulin level go back down. And when we eat, it can go back up naturally, but then we don't keep snacking all day. If you need to snack all day, you're never going to let your body burn fat and become insulin resistant. As an experiment, a few weeks ago, I got one of these right there. That's a continuous glucose monitor. So I can actually take my phone and I can go up to that and see in general what my interstitial blood level is. And this is about, if we can see, I don't know, I guess we can't see that very well, but I have there on one of the two screens, you can see that it's staying in a nice lower range pretty much all day. I had a little spike after one little meal. And sometimes it's a little fun.
There you go.
There we go. Sometimes it's fun. Like I may decide I'm going to go out, like last weekend, I decided to have some Thai food with some pad Thai and glucose and some rice just to see, because I love the flavor, but I knew it was going to spike things. And it spiked up to about 130 up here and back down. Now, these numbers aren't exactly the same as the blood glucose level is, so I can test it with a finger prick, and I can also test my ketones with a finger prick. But this is a general approximation of where it should be. And this gives me an idea of how metabolically flexible I am, so I can burn my own fat. And if I do have the carbohydrates, I can do them, and my body knows how to process them quickly, and I get back to burning the fats. So getting back and converting, however, it could take 3 to 4 weeks before you start feeling a little more normal on the fats if you haven't used those enzymes in a long time. And if you're a high-level athlete, it may take you 4 to 5 months or more to get back to a world-class level of running or skiing or cross-country skiing or something like that. Because you just need to optimize it at that level. It takes longer for our bodies to get that way. But it's very doable, and our body really is healthier on that. And we tend to live longer and are healthier eating this way.
So I'm already hearing lots of future conversations. I can hear we need to talk more about intermittent fasting. I hear we need to talk more about what are the ways to have optimal balance with the fats and the good fats. This is really a fascinating conversation. And there's just time for one more question. So I saw one more question popped up. I'll let you read it there.
It's sort of scrolled up. I can't see this. Actually, I don't see, I think most of the questions are taken care of. We talked about fasting briefly.
Okay, yes.
And we also talked about the different exercise programs. So like once or twice a week, I have been working on the program with the electrical stimulation, right? I also do weightlifting with the Olympic weights. I also do what's called blood flow restriction training, and I recommend that it's a lot of these to my patients to help decrease loads. So I want to get healthy and be optimized as best as I can personally, and that's what drives me, is I want to be as healthy as I can be, and then I share that with my friends, patients, and colleagues.
So in conclusion for today, the ideal protein, if you want to go home with your calculators and figure it out, multiply your weight by 0.7.
That's a reasonable number. To
have a reasonable number. And if any of our audience participants would like to reach out to you to know more, can we reference your website? Can we reference?
Probably check a website, and that you can. I'm still working on that, but if you look at HAZMD, HASZMD at Gmail or at .com, HAZMD.com.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you very much. This was a fascinating conversation. I'm thrilled. I enjoyed it so much. We hope all of you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to talk about more nutrition, be in touch with Personal 20, and we'd like to organize that for you. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you for being here.